Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is John Hardie, Deputy Director of the FDD's Russia program. John, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
This week marked the third anniversary of Russia's invasion into Ukraine and the subsequent war that has followed and still continues to rage on. And I think now's a really good time to talk about the United States' relationship with Ukraine, how it's evolved, as well as the evolution of our relationship with Russia. So when Donald Trump was on the campaign trail, he said that he could end the war in 24 hours. And in the past couple of weeks, we've seen increasingly hostile rhetoric about Ukraine and about President Volodymyr Zelensky from the Trump administration, as well as President Trump himself. We've seen President Trump call Zelensky a dictator, falsely claiming that Ukraine started the war, and saying Ukraine should not be involved in peace talks. So when you're looking at the events of the past few weeks, what sticks out to you?
Well, I think this new minerals agreement, which it sounds like there's an agreement in place, at least for the framework of a deal, the follow-on, more specific agreement to follow. I hope this minerals deal will put to bed some of the acrimony that we've seen between Trump and Zelensky. And so I hope going forward we can find a way to be united, because I think that's really critical if we're going to maximize our chances for a good peace agreement. There has to be strong support for Ukraine, and if Putin sees that support diminishing, he's going to be less likely to find a compromise.
When you're looking at that minerals agreement that is potentially in place right now, do you think, A, that will have any impact on the war, and B, we know Donald Trump is a tough negotiator when it comes to certain terms, like he's used tariffs as a negotiating tactic. Do you think he was calling Zelensky a dictator, saying Ukraine started the war, as some sort of negotiating tactic for this mineral deal?
Yeah, I think the harsh words from Trump were in part reflecting his frustration with Ukraine for not immediately signing the deal, and also probably a form of pressure on Zelensky. In terms of the impact of the agreement, I don't think the agreement itself has a direct effect on the war, but what it could do is make President Trump more likely to continue military aid for Ukraine, which, as I mentioned, is really critical. Ukraine depends on the United States for some key capabilities, for example, ballistic missile defense. So having that aid continue puts Ukraine and the U.S. In turn in a better position to try to get a good peace deal.
As we sit here right now, we see a different relationship with Russia under President Trump versus under President Biden. President Trump talked to Putin. There's also the United States is engaged in another round of talks with Russia. The U.S., along with Russia, North Korea, and a handful of other countries, voted against a UN resolution which condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What do you think of our relationship right now with Russia?
Well, I think the breaking with European allies and Ukraine at the UN, at the G7, at the WTO, and some of these recent statements is unfortunate optics. I think the administration's approach is, President Trump famously or infamously tends to speak rather flatteringly of people like Vladimir Putin, especially when in negotiations. I wouldn't take that as a sign that he's going to cave to everything Putin wants, but his approach is to sort of speak kindly. He thinks that is helpful for negotiations, and perhaps he's right. I think what's more important than these UN statements, etc., is the tangible commitment we're going to make to Ukraine. Is Donald Trump prepared to continue that? Is he prepared to provide some sort of backstop to a potential European reassurance force in Ukraine? I think those are the kind of core issues that I would judge the administration's approach to negotiations on.
When you're looking at these seemingly warmer relations that the United States has now towards Russia, do you think that impacts our relationships with allies and our friends across the pond and in Europe?
Yeah, I think European countries are really alarmed right now. I think that the Trump administration didn't do a great job, to put it politely, of coordinating with allies before launching that phone call with Putin. But obviously, European allies and Ukraine, for that matter, were not invited to the talks in Saudi Arabia. And the administration has made quite clear that over time, the U.S. Contribution to ensuring European security will likely diminish as we focus on China. And that last bit, I don't think is necessarily wrong, but the sequencing, I think, is important, right? Because European countries right now, they are dependent on the United States militarily. They're designed to sort of plug in to the United States military as kind of the key enabler and leader of military operations. And so they're going to need time to invest in their own capabilities and institutional capacity to replace at least some of what the U.S. provides. So we don't want to kind of leave Europe in the lurch as we pivot to focus on China. And one sort of positive thing about this horrible war in Ukraine is that it does degrade the Russian military. U.S. support is a really efficient way. U.S. support Ukraine is a really efficient way of degrading our second greatest adversary. And the more we degrade the Russian military, the more leeway and the less risk we have as we kind of navigate that difficult transition to Europe taking on a greater role for its security.
When you're looking at what's happened in the past 3 years, I remember covering and looking at the Russia-Ukraine war when it started 3 years ago, and everyone thought Ukraine was going to be just flattened within a couple of days. Clearly, that is not the case as the war continues 3 years later. It's clear President Trump wants a ceasefire. It's also clear some Republicans are getting sick of the United States giving aid to Ukraine. So what do you think, and when can we expect a deal between Russia and Ukraine to end this war? And what do you think that really needs to look like?
Right. Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think the point I would make, kind of stepping back, is whatever deal might emerge from these negotiations, in my view, it's unlikely to resolve the fundamental question at stake in this war, which is the future of Ukraine and Putin's goal to make it a vassal state to Ukraine, sort of like Belarus. Russia has failed to kind of compel Ukraine to accept that condition through military means, and unless it's forced to, Ukraine isn't going to accept that for very good reason, right? And so, as much as Russia might try to impose those terms at the negotiating table, well, don't think it's going to be successful. After all, we saw this. That's exactly what happened with the previous agreement after the last war, the so-called Minsk agreements, where Kyiv wasn't about to implement key parts of those agreements that would have basically handed over its sovereignty to Russia, right? So I think that it's the end to the war, however it ends, will be probably inconclusive, and the chances of a follow-on war, a third invasion, will be quite high. And so we in the United States and our Western allies need to focus on, how do we help Ukraine be in the best position to deter and defeat that potential third invasion. And so that means continued military aid, training, etc. The security guarantees, whatever form they take, will probably be dependent on whatever deal is reached, if there is one. But I think from the United States perspective, we need to be providing Europe with clarity on the type of contribution they can expect from the United States, absent American boots on the ground in Ukraine, to make a potential reassurance force military and politically credible.
I'm a student of history here, and I know that there have been a lot of comparisons with World War II and the beginning of that when some of Europe did appease Germany. Do you think if there's a ceasefire deal that has some sort of appeasement to Russia, we could see a similar thing happen that we did almost 100 years ago?
Right. I don't think appeasing Putin is the way to go. I think the way to get a good deal, or at least maximize chances for a good deal, is to, for example, tighten sanctions on Russia, targeting its oil revenue, kind of accelerate the woes in its economy and shorten the timeline that it can sustain the war, continue providing aid to Ukraine to exhaust Russia's offensive potential as they try to grind their way forward through Ukraine. Because, look, if Putin knows his forces can't make progress on the battlefield, if he knows he can't sustain the war, well, he might be more flexible in coming to terms, or at least ending the fighting. As I say, I'm not sure that'll be the final word on this kind of struggle down the road, but we can at least stop the killing for now and then focus on the next chapter.
You're the expert here, and it feels like there are a few balls in the air right now before we can get to that next chapter. So what are you looking out for right now before we get to any sort of ceasefire, negotiation, or agreement?
Well, one thing is precisely the topic of the meetings, the reason why Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron have visited Trump back to back, and that's to get, as I mentioned earlier, some sort of U.S. commitment to a backstop for that potential European peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Another issue is basically the what sort of deal or kind of terms the Trump administration will begin to float to the two parties. We saw last weekend envoy Steve Witkoff, one of President Trump's officials tapped to lead these negotiations, suggests that the Trump administration would use a 2022 draft agreement between Russia and Ukraine as the basis, kind of a starting point or a guidepost in his word for talks. Well, that deal I think would have been pretty favorable to Russia, and I'm not sure Kyiv would accept those terms here now. And I don't think those terms in the agreement, including limits on the size of the Ukrainian military, would be beneficial, since, as I mentioned, our goal should be to help Ukraine deter and defeat potential additional Russian aggression.
Well, John, there are certainly a lot of developments that will be unfolding, and as they do, I hope you come back on, share your insights, share your expertise with us. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate the conversation.
Thanks for having me.